August 21st, 2000, 4:47 in the morning, 107 meters beneath the surface of the Barents Sea. Norwegian diver. Graham Mann's hands were shaking as he pulled the folded piece of paper from the dead sailor's pocket. His diving partner held the underwater light steady, illuminating the cramped space of what had once been the ninth compartment of the Russian nuclear submarine Kursk. Around them, the bodies of 23 men floated in the flooded chamber, preserved by the freezing Arctic water. Mann had seen death before. He was a professional with decades of experience in the most dangerous diving conditions on Earth. But nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing could have prepared anyone for this. The paper was wet, the ink smeared in places. But as Mann carefully unfolded it, holding his breath, the words became visible. Words written in Russian, words that would later be translated and shared with the world. Words that would reveal exactly what happened in the final hours of the Kursk. Well, it is dark here to write, but I will try to feel my way. It seems there is no chance, 10 to 20%. The diver's hands trembled harder now, and it had nothing to do with the cold. Those words had been written by Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov, a 27-year-old naval officer who had survived the initial catastrophe that destroyed his submarine. He had written them in complete darkness, using a grease pencil, working entirely by touch. He had written them knowing he was going to die. But it wasn't the assessment of his own death that made this note so devastating. It was the list. 23 names, carefully documented. Every sailor who had survived the explosions and gathered in the ninth compartment to wait for rescue. 23 men who had followed their training, activated emergency systems, and done everything right. 23 men who had been alive for hours while the Russian Navy fumbled and failed above them. 23 men who died waiting for help that came far too late. The damage report that investigators compiled in the months following the disaster would reveal, in clinical detail, exactly why the crew of the Kursk never had a chance. Technical failures, human errors, a cascade of catastrophic decisions that turned a survivable accident into a mass grave. But what no damage report could fully capture was the human tragedy at the heart of this story, the courage of men facing certain death, the incompetence of those who should have saved them, the lies told to cover up the truth. If you're finding this story as gripping as I am, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. What I'm about to tell you will change how you think about military disasters, government cover-ups, and the incredible courage of ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand why those 23 men had no chance, you need to understand what happened in the months, days, and hours before that terrible morning. The K-141 Kursk was, by any measure, an engineering marvel. Commissioned in 1994, she was an Oscar II-class nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine, one of the most powerful weapons in the Russian arsenal. At 154 meters long and 18 meters wide, she was nearly twice the length of a Boeing 747. Her displacement exceeded 14,000 tons. She was, quite literally, a moving city beneath the waves. Her weapon systems were equally impressive. The Kursk carried 24 P-700 Granite cruise missiles, NATO designation shipwreck, each capable of traveling at twice the speed of sound and delivering a 750-kilogram warhead to a target 300 miles away. A single Granite could sink a destroyer. A salvo could devastate an entire carrier battle group. The submarine also carried conventional torpedoes, including the Type A65-76A, a behemoth of a weapon, nearly 11 meters long and 650 millimeters in diameter. These torpedoes were designed for one purpose: destroying aircraft carriers. They carried warheads large enough to break a ship's back with a single hit. And it was one of these torpedoes that would kill 118 men. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the summer of 2000, the Russian Northern Fleet was preparing for its largest naval exercise in over a decade. Codenamed Summer X, the exercise was designed to showcase Russian military might to the world. After years of post-Soviet decline, the Russian Navy wanted to prove it was still a force to be reckoned with. The Kursk was to play a starring role in these exercises. Her commanding officer, Captain First Rank Gennady Lyashin, was one of the most experienced submarine commanders in the fleet. At 45 years old, Lyashin had spent most of his adult life beneath the waves. He knew his submarine better than he knew his own apartment. Lyashin was also a man who loved his family deeply. His wife Irina had been begging him to retire for months. The submarine service was dangerous, she said. He had given enough. It was time to come home. Lyashin had promised her that this exercise would be his last deployment. After Summer X, he would put in his papers. He would become a landlocked man, content to watch the sea from the shore. He never got the chance. On August 10th, 2000, the Kursk departed from her home port of Vidyayevo on the Kola Peninsula. Her crew of 118 included some of the best sailors in the Russian Navy, along with younger conscripts still learning the ropes. The average age aboard was just 34. Among the crew was Dmitry Kolesnikov, the 27-year-old captain-lieutenant who would later write the note that haunted the world. Kolesnikov was in charge of the submarine's turbine section, a position that required technical expertise and leadership ability. His superiors had marked him as a rising star, destined for command of his own submarine someday. Kolesnikov had been married for just 2 years. His wife Olga was waiting for him back in Vidyayevo. They had been planning to start a family after this deployment. Kolesnikov had told friends he wanted to be a father. He was ready for the next chapter of his life. He would never see Olga again. There was also Senior Warrant Officer Vladimir Kuznetsov, a 42-year-old veteran who had served on submarines for over 20 years. Kuznetsov was known throughout the fleet as one of the most capable technicians in the service. When something broke, Kuznetsov could fix it. He had a gift for understanding complex machinery that bordered on the intuitive. Kuznetsov had 3 children back home. The youngest, a daughter named Svetlana, had just turned 7. She had made him a good luck charm before this deployment, a small bracelet woven from colored thread. Kuznetsov wore it, hidden beneath his uniform sleeve. And there was 19-year-old conscript Alexei Mitayev on his first major deployment. Mitayev had been nervous about the exercise, confiding to his bunkmate that the submarine made him uneasy. Something about being so deep underwater, surrounded by all that pressure. But he had been trained to follow orders, to trust his superiors, to believe that the Russian Navy knew what it was doing. All 3 of these men would survive the initial explosions. All 3 would gather in the 9th compartment with the other survivors. All 3 would die waiting for rescue. The exercise began normally enough. For 2 days, the Kursk participated in various maneuvers, her crew performing the complex choreography of submarine warfare. They tracked surface ships. They practiced evasion techniques. They prepared for the main event, a live-fire torpedo exercise scheduled for the morning of August 12th. It was during preparations for this exercise that everything went wrong. August 12th, 2000, 11:27 in the morning. The Kursk was cruising at a depth of approximately 18 meters just below periscope depth. The sea above was calm, the weather excellent, perfect conditions for a torpedo launch. In the forward torpedo room, ordnance technicians were preparing the weapon that would be used for the exercise. It was a Type 65-76A practice torpedo, one of the massive carrier killers that formed the backbone of the Kursk's offensive capability. But here's the detail that changed everything, the detail that would later become the centerpiece of every investigation. The Type 65 76A torpedo used a propulsion system called high test peroxide, or HTP. This is a concentrated form of hydrogen peroxide, typically around 65% concentration, that reacts violently when it comes into contact with certain catalysts. When properly controlled, HTP provides enormous power for its weight, making it ideal for torpedo propulsion. When not properly controlled, HTP becomes a bomb. The United States Navy had learned this lesson the hard way. In May 1955, the submarine USS Cochino experienced an HTP torpedo explosion during routine operations. The incident killed 1 sailor and led the U.S. Navy to abandon HTP propulsion entirely. Britain followed suit after several similar accidents. By the 1960s, Western navies had moved to safer, battery-powered torpedoes. The Soviet Union, however, never made that transition. HTP torpedoes were cheaper to manufacture, and in the cash-strapped years following the Soviet collapse, cost often trumped safety. The Type 65-76A remained in service, despite multiple incidents suggesting the technology was dangerously unstable. In fact, Soviet and Russian submarines had experienced at least 3 serious HTP-related accidents before the Kursk. In 1967, the submarine K-27 suffered an explosion during torpedo loading. In 1981, K-462 had a near-catastrophic leak. In 1984, K-210 experienced fuel contamination that could have led to disaster. Each time, the Russian Navy documented the incident, made minor adjustments, and continued using the dangerous technology. The specific torpedo loaded aboard the Kursk on August 12, 2000, had been manufactured in 1990. It was 10 years old, near the end of its recommended service life. According to later investigations, it should have been retired and replaced with a newer weapon. Instead, it was cleared for use. Nobody knew that somewhere in the torpedo's fuel system a microscopic crack had developed. High-test peroxide was already seeping into spaces where it was never meant to be. A chemical reaction was slowly building, invisible, unstoppable. At 11:28 and 27 seconds, that reaction reached critical mass. The first explosion was later estimated at approximately 100 kilograms of TNT equivalent. It detonated inside the torpedo tube, killing everyone in the forward compartment instantly. The blast wave propagated through the submarine's bow section, rupturing pipes, tearing apart equipment, igniting everything flammable. Norwegian seismic monitoring stations detected the explosion 400 kilometers away. They recorded it as a magnitude 2.2 event, significant enough to be noticed but not immediately alarming. Similar readings could be caused by underwater geological activity. Inside the Kursk, the surviving crew members had seconds to react. Alarms screamed. Emergency bulkheads began closing automatically, designed to contain flooding and preserve the rest of the submarine. In the aft compartments, men scrambled to understand what had happened. Vladimir Kuznetsov was in the turbine section when the first explosion hit. The shockwave threw him against a bulkhead, dislocating his shoulder. Despite the pain, his training kicked in immediately. He began securing equipment, shutting down systems that could cause secondary damage, preparing for whatever came next. Dmitry Kolesnikov was in the 8th compartment, reviewing maintenance logs. He heard the explosion, felt the submarine shudder, and immediately began moving toward the 9th compartment. Whatever had happened forward, the 9th compartment was where survivors would gather. Alexei Matayev was in his bunk, off duty, when the world exploded around him. He tumbled out of his rack, hit the deck hard, and lay stunned for precious seconds before another sailor grabbed his arm and dragged him toward the emergency hatch. But the first explosion was only the beginning. The initial blast had ruptured other torpedoes in the compartment. Their warheads were now exposed to the intense heat of the spreading fire. Their fuel was leaking, mixing with flames. The laws of chemistry are unforgiving. 2 minutes and 15 seconds after the first explosion, at 11:30 and 42 seconds, the secondary detonation occurred. This was not an explosion. This was an apocalypse. Later analysis estimated the yield at between 2 and 3 tons of TNT equivalent. The blast registered magnitude 4.2 on seismic monitors across northern Europe. Scientists in Alaska detected the shock wave traveling through the Earth's crust. The explosion punched a hole in the seabed below the submarine and created a debris field that extended hundreds of meters in every direction. Inside the Kursk, the forward compartment simply ceased to exist. The blast obliterated everything in its path. Compartments 1 through 5 were destroyed in milliseconds, killing everyone inside instantly. The submarine's bow section crumpled like aluminum foil. The Kursk's nuclear reactors, located in the midsection of the boat, shut down automatically when the shockwave hit. This was by design, a safety feature to prevent a nuclear accident. But it also meant that all power was lost. Lights went out. Ventilation stopped. Navigation systems failed. In complete darkness, what remained of the Kursk plummeted to the ocean floor. She struck the seabed at an angle, her shattered bow burying itself in the muddy bottom while her stern remained elevated. The depth gauge, if anyone had been able to read it, would have shown 107 meters. Not particularly deep by submarine standards, but deep enough that escape to the surface was impossible without assistance. Of the 118 men who had set out from Vidyayevo 2 days earlier, 72 were dead before the submarine even hit bottom. They died in the explosions, killed by fire and blast and shrapnel before they could even register what was happening. Captain Lyakin was among the dead. So was every other senior officer who had been in the forward section. The chain of command had been obliterated in an instant. But here is where the story takes its most tragic turn. Not everyone died. In the aft section of the submarine, protected by the heavy bulkheads that had automatically sealed during the emergency, 23 men survived. They had been at their stations when the explosions occurred, far enough from the blast zone that the direct effects hadn't reached them. These survivors found themselves in a nightmare scenario that their training had never truly prepared them for. The 9th compartment was designed as a refuge of last resort, a place where the crew could gather in an emergency and await rescue. It was equipped with emergency supplies, including chemical oxygen generators, food rations, water, and medical equipment. In theory, it could sustain survivors for several days. In theory. The reality was far more complicated. When Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov reached the 9th compartment, he found chaos. Men were flooding in from the 6th, 7th, and 8th compartments, some injured, all terrified. The emergency lighting had failed, plunging everything into absolute darkness. The only illumination came from personal flashlights, their batteries already beginning to fade. Kolesnikov was the senior surviving officer. In the absence of Captain Lyakin, who had died in the forward section, command fell to him. He was 27 years old, facing a situation that would have tested the most experienced admiral. He did not hesitate. Working in the darkness, Kolesnikov organized the survivors. He conducted a head count, methodically accounting for every man in the compartment. He assigned tasks. Some men would activate the chemical oxygen generators, others would check for flooding, still others would attempt to establish communication with the surface. Vladimir Kuznetsov, despite his injured shoulder, took charge of the technical systems. He checked the hull integrity, assessed the damage to the compartment's seals, calculated how long their air supply might last. His report to Kolesnikov was grim but professional. They had perhaps 6 to 8 hours of breathable air, maybe less if they exerted themselves. Alexei Mitayev, the young conscript who had been so nervous about the deployment, found himself assigned to the communication team. Their job was simple but critical. Tap on the hull. Use wrenches, pipes, anything metal to send SOS signals in Morse code. Keep tapping until someone answered. Using a grease pencil and a scrap of paper torn from a logbook, Kolesnikov began documenting everything. Names, conditions, actions taken. He worked by touch, unable to see what he was writing, trusting that someone would eventually read his words. He listed 23 names, every survivor, every man who was depending on him. Then he began the slow process of waiting. Above the sunken submarine, the Russian Navy knew something had gone wrong. The explosions had been detected by multiple vessels participating in the exercise. The Kursk had missed scheduled communication windows. Search and rescue protocols were activated. But here's where incompetence began to compound tragedy. The Russian Navy's initial response was paralyzed by bureaucracy and confusion. Different commands gave contradictory orders. Communication systems that should have coordinated the search instead transmitted conflicting information. Valuable hours were lost as officers debated jurisdiction and authority. Admiral Vyacheslav Popov, commander of the Northern Fleet, was conducting a surface exercise when the Kursk disappeared. When he was informed that the submarine had missed its communications window, his first instinct was not alarm but irritation. Submarines sometimes had radio problems. It wasn't necessarily cause for panic. This assumption cost precious hours. It took nearly 16 hours for search vessels to even locate the Kursk on the seabed. 16 hours during which the survivors in the ninth compartment waited in darkness, tapping SOS signals on the hull, praying that someone would hear. Someone did hear. The rescue vessel Mikhail Rudnitsky, equipped with underwater acoustic sensors, detected the tapping shortly after midnight on August 13th. The signals were faint but unmistakable, rhythmic hammering in the pattern of Morse code, the universal signal of distress. Men were alive down there. The knowledge should have triggered an immediate, all-out rescue effort. Every resource should have been mobilized. International assistance should have been requested immediately. Instead, the Russian Navy began a rescue operation that would later be described as one of the most bungled in maritime history. The primary rescue asset was the Priz-class deep submergence rescue vehicle, a small submarine designed specifically for rescuing crews from sunken vessels. The Priz could, in theory, dock with the escape hatch of a submarine and transfer survivors to safety. In practice, the prize was 20 years old, poorly maintained, and operated by a crew that had conducted almost no real-world rescue training. The batteries that powered the vehicle were worn out. The docking mechanisms were unreliable. The entire system was a product of Soviet-era technology that had never been properly updated. The first rescue attempt occurred on August 13th, roughly 24 hours after the explosions. The Priz descended to the Kursk, approached the escape hatch, and attempted to establish a seal. It failed. The strong currents at the bottom pushed the rescue vehicle off course. The docking collar couldn't achieve proper alignment. After 3 hours of trying, the Priz was forced to return to the surface. The second attempt came 12 hours later. Same result. The batteries were weakening. The mechanical systems were failing. The crew was exhausted. Day 3, day 4, the same pattern repeated. Descent, approach, failure, return. Each failed attempt took hours. Each failure cost the survivors more of their dwindling oxygen supply. Inside the ninth compartment, the survivors could hear the rescue vehicle overhead. They knew help was trying to reach them. But day after day, the attempts failed. Dmitry Kolesnikov continued writing his notes, documenting the passage of time and the deteriorating conditions. The oxygen generators were being used, but they couldn't produce air fast enough for 23 men engaged in physical labor. The carbon dioxide levels were rising. Some of the men were becoming drowsy, confused. Vladimir Kuznetsov worked tirelessly to extend their survival time. He jury-rigged systems, cannibalized equipment, did everything his years of experience had taught him. But there was only so much that even the best technician could do with the resources available. Alexei Mitayev kept tapping. His hands blistered, then bled, then went numb. He wrapped them in strips torn from his uniform and kept tapping. The rhythm of Morse code became his entire world. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS, SOS, SOS. At some point, Kolesnikov wrote a note to his wife. "Mustn't despair," he told her. 2 simple words that carried the weight of a dying man's love. He also calculated their chances of survival. Working the math in his head, estimating remaining oxygen and rescue timelines, he arrived at a number that must have been devastating to commit to paper. "It seems there is no chance, 10 to 20%. That assessment was tragically accurate. What Kolesnikov didn't know, couldn't have known, was that his estimate might actually have been optimistic, given how the rescue was being conducted. As Russian efforts continued to fail, the international community began offering help. Norway, which had extensive experience with deep-sea rescue operations, offered to send divers and equipment. The Norwegian diving company Stolt Offshore had assets that could reach the Kursk within hours and had technology far superior to anything the Russians possessed. The Norwegian offer was detailed and specific. They could have a dive team on site within 18 hours. Their divers had experience working at depths of over 200 meters. Their equipment was modern, well-maintained, and proven in actual rescue operations. Britain offered its LR-5 rescue submarine, a state-of-the-art vehicle specifically designed for submarine rescue operations. The LR-5 had advanced docking capabilities and a much higher success rate than the aging Russian prize. British officials made clear they could have the LR-5 at the site within 48 hours. Both offers were refused. For 5 agonizing days, the Russian government rejected international assistance. The reasons given varied. The foreign equipment wasn't compatible. The situation was under control. National security concerns prevented foreign access to a classified vessel. The real reasons were simpler and uglier: pride, paranoia, fear of embarrassment. The Russian military establishment couldn't accept that their rescue capabilities were inadequate. They couldn't allow foreign divers to access a nuclear submarine and its classified systems. They couldn't admit to the world and to their own people that they needed help. Foreign ministry officials worried about the optics of accepting Western assistance. Military commanders feared that foreign divers would gather intelligence on Russian submarine technology. Political advisors calculated that admitting failure would be worse than gambling on a Russian solution. And so they let 23 men die. The exact timeline of death in the ninth compartment would never be precisely determined. What investigators pieced together from evidence, from Kolesnikov's notes, from forensic analysis of the bodies, painted a picture of men fighting for survival until the very end. The chemical oxygen generators, called cassettes, worked by combining potassium superoxide with carbon dioxide and water vapor exhaled by the sailors. The chemical reaction produced oxygen while absorbing carbon dioxide. In theory, it was a clever system that could keep men alive for extended periods. In practice, the system had a fatal flaw. The cassettes were designed for use in air, not water. They were supposed to function in a dry environment where they could be safely handled and positioned, but the ninth compartment was anything but dry. Water was seeping in through damaged seals, pooling on the deck, splashing onto equipment. Vladimir Kuznetsov had warned about this. He had noticed the water intrusion early and tried to contain it. But the seals were compromised, the pumps were offline, and there was nothing he could do to stop the slow flooding. At some point, likely in the afternoon or evening of August 12th, one of the cassettes came into contact with oily water. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Potassium superoxide reacts violently with hydrocarbons. When the cassette contacted the diesel-contaminated water, it ignited in a flash fire that consumed the remaining oxygen in the compartment within seconds. The fire also released toxic gases, including carbon monoxide, that poisoned the air even further. The men in the ninth compartment had no chance to react. One moment they were waiting, hoping, conserving energy. The next moment, the air itself turned deadly. Dmitry Kolesnikov likely died within seconds of the ignition. Vladimir Kuznetsov, who was near the oxygen generators, may have died even faster. Young Alexei Mitayev, his hands still wrapped in bloody bandages from days of tapping, never knew what killed him. Forensic analysis of the bodies found evidence consistent with flash fire exposure and carbon monoxide poisoning. The survivors had died within minutes of the cassette ignition, likely without even understanding what had killed them. The terrible irony is that the very system designed to keep them alive had ended their lives. When Norwegian divers finally reached the Kursk on August 21st, 9 days after the disaster, they found exactly what they feared. The ninth compartment was flooded. All 23 survivors were dead. The rescue that might have saved them had come far too late. Graham Mann, the diver who retrieved Kolesnikov's note, would later describe the experience as the most difficult moment of his career. He had participated in underwater recoveries before. He had seen bodies, dealt with death, but nothing compared to finding those 23 men preserved by the cold water, still wearing the expressions of hope that had sustained them until the end. The note he retrieved was partially waterlogged, some sections illegible, but enough survived to tell the story that Kolesnikov had so desperately wanted the world to know. In the months that followed, a comprehensive investigation attempted to piece together exactly what had happened. The damage report that emerged was over 500 pages long, detailing every technical failure, every human error, every decision that contributed to the disaster. The torpedo that caused the initial explosion had been improperly maintained. Its fuel system should have been inspected more thoroughly. The flaw that caused the leak should have been detected. The rescue operation had been catastrophically inadequate. Equipment was obsolete and poorly maintained. Training was insufficient. Coordination was chaotic. The refusal of international help had been a fatal mistake. Norwegian and British rescuers could have reached the survivors within 24 to 36 hours of the disaster. They had the technology, the training, and the expertise that the Russian Navy lacked. The damage report concluded that the survivors in the ninth compartment had lived for approximately 6 to 8 hours after the initial explosions, perhaps longer. The exact timeline was impossible to determine, but the evidence suggested they had been alive well into the afternoon of August 12th, possibly even longer. They had been alive while Russian rescue attempts repeatedly failed. They had been alive while international offers of help were refused. They had been alive while bureaucrats debated and generals postured and politicians calculated. And then they had died, killed by the very equipment meant to save them in a flash of fire that their own government's incompetence had made inevitable. The political aftermath of the Kursk disaster was explosive. President Vladimir Putin, who had been in office for less than a year, initially stayed on vacation in Sochi for several days after the sinking. When he finally returned to Moscow and addressed the nation, his performance was widely criticized as cold and defensive. Putin's vacation lasted while families of the crew members gathered at Vidyayevo, desperate for information. It lasted while Russian and international media questioned why help wasn't being accepted. It lasted while 23 men died in darkness beneath the Barents Sea. When Putin finally spoke publicly, he blamed the media for sensationalism. He blamed Western governments for offering help with ulterior motives. He blamed everyone except the system that had failed so spectacularly. In an interview with American journalist Larry King, Putin was asked what had happened to the Kursk. He smiled slightly and gave a one-word answer. It sank. That callous response became a symbol of the government's handling of the entire disaster. Families of the victims, desperate for information and accountability, were met with stonewalling, disinformation, and, in some cases, outright hostility. One of the most disturbing incidents occurred during a government meeting with the families. Nadezhda Tillich, the mother of a sailor who died on the Kursk, confronted officials about the handling of the rescue. Her grief and anger overwhelmed her. She began shouting, demanding answers, refusing to be silenced. A woman in medical scrubs approached her from behind and injected her with a sedative without her consent. Tillich collapsed, unconscious, and was removed from the meeting. The entire scene was captured on camera by a news crew and broadcast around the world. It became one of the defining images of the Kursk disaster. A grieving mother, silenced by her own government, dragged away while officials looked on impassively. The Russian government would later claim that Tillich had been given medication for her own safety, that she had been hysterical and needed to be calmed. Few believed this explanation. The image of a mother being drugged for demanding answers about her dead son spoke louder than any official statement. The families organized and demanded accountability. They filed lawsuits against the government. They gave interviews to foreign media when Russian outlets wouldn't cover their stories. They became, in a sense, the conscience of a nation that had tried to forget what happened. Olga Kolesnikova, Dmitri's widow, became one of the most prominent voices. She spoke about her husband's courage, his dedication, his love for his country and his crew. She refused to let his memory be erased or his sacrifice be forgotten. He died doing his duty, she said in one interview. But he didn't have to die. They could have saved him. They chose not to. The investigations continued for over a year. In October 2001, the Kursk herself was raised from the seabed in one of the largest salvage operations ever attempted. Dutch and Norwegian companies performed the work, another task the Russian Navy proved incapable of completing on its own. When the submarine's hulk finally broke the surface, investigators were able to conduct a complete forensic examination. The results confirmed everything the damage reports had suggested. The torpedo compartment was completely destroyed, barely recognizable as part of a submarine. The forward bulkheads had failed catastrophically, allowing the blast effects to propagate much further than they should have. Design flaws in the submarine's structure had contributed to the extent of the damage. The ninth compartment showed clear evidence of the flash fire that had killed the survivors. Burn marks on the walls and deck, carbon deposits on equipment, bodies found in positions suggesting sudden, unexpected death rather than gradual suffocation. The 23 notes and documents recovered from the survivors told the story of men who had done everything right. They had organized. They had conserved resources. They had maintained discipline. They had waited for rescue with as much patience and courage as anyone could reasonably expect. They had deserved better. The Kursk disaster forced significant changes in the Russian Navy. New safety protocols were implemented. Rescue capabilities were upgraded. International cooperation agreements were established to allow faster response to future emergencies. The HTP torpedoes were finally retired from service. New electric-powered weapons replaced them, decades after Western navies had made the same transition. The accident that had been waiting to happen would never happen again. Or so they hoped. But many observers noted that these reforms came too late for the 118 men who died on August 12, 2000. They came too late for the 23 survivors who had waited in darkness, hoping against hope. The story of the Kursk is, in many ways, a story about systems failure. Every link in the chain that should have protected those men broke. The torpedoes that should have been safe were deadly. The rescue equipment that should have been adequate was obsolete. The leadership that should have accepted help refused it. But it is also a story about individual courage in the face of impossible odds. Dmitry Kolesnikov didn't have to write those notes. In the darkness, facing certain death, he could have given in to despair. Instead, he documented everything. He organized his men. He maintained discipline. He wrote to his wife. Mustn't despair. Vladimir Kuznetsov didn't have to keep working with a dislocated shoulder. He could have given up, let others handle things, accepted that the situation was hopeless. Instead, he used every bit of his 20 years of experience to extend his comrades' lives by whatever minutes or hours he could. Alexei Mitayev didn't have to keep tapping. A 19-year-old conscript on his first deployment, he could have been forgiven for curling up in a corner and waiting to die. Instead, he kept sending signals until his hands bled, until his strength failed, until there was nothing left. These men, and the 20 others who died with them, showed us the best of what humanity can be. In their final hours, they didn't think about themselves. They thought about each other. They thought about rescue. They thought about the families waiting for them back home. Their courage deserves to be remembered. The memorial to the Kursk in Vidyayevo lists 118 names. Every year on August 12th, families gather to remember. The names are read aloud. Flowers are laid. The men are not forgotten. Among those names is Dmitry Kolesnikov, the 27-year-old captain-lieutenant who wrote the most famous note in Russian naval history. His widow, Olga, eventually remarried and tried to build a new life. But she has spoken publicly about how she can never truly move on, how she still thinks about those final hours, how she still wonders what Dmitry was thinking in the darkness. His note told her not to despair. She has tried to honor that wish, but some wounds never fully heal. The Kursk herself has been largely scrapped now. The remains were disposed of in ways that allow the Russian government to control what evidence survives. But you cannot scrap memory. You cannot dispose of truth. The story of the Kursk endures because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature. It shows us the worst of what institutions can become when they lose sight of their purpose. It shows us the best of what individuals can be when they face the unthinkable. And it poses a question that has no easy answer. What would you do in those final hours? What would you write in the darkness? Who would you think of as the oxygen ran out? Dmitry Kolesnikov gave us his answers. He thought of his crew. He documented the truth. He told his wife to keep hope. Vladimir Kuznetsov gave us his answers. He worked until he couldn't work anymore, trying to save his brothers. Alexei Mitayev gave us his answers. He kept sending signals, kept believing someone would come, kept hoping until hope was no longer possible. In doing so, they gave all of us something to hold on to, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, courage and love can endure, that even when systems fail and institutions betray us, the human spirit can find a way to leave something meaningful behind. The damage report told us the crew had no chance. But Dmitry Kolesnikov's note told us they faced that knowledge with dignity, with courage, and with love. That is the true legacy of the Kursk. Not the failures that killed 118 men, but the courage with which those men faced their deaths, the notes they left behind, the truth they preserved, the love they expressed with their final words. Mustn't despair. 24 years later, those words still have the power to move us. They remind us what matters most. They challenge us to be worthy of the courage they represent. The men of the Kursk deserve better than the fate they received. May their memory be a blessing. May their sacrifice never be forgotten. And may we learn at last the lessons their deaths were meant to teach. The damage report is now declassified. The truth is known. The failures have been documented. What remains is the choice we make in response. Do we let their deaths be meaningless? Or do we honor them by building systems that work, institutions that care, cultures that put human lives above institutional pride? The men of the Kursk can't answer that question. Only we can. 118 souls. 23 survivors who became victims. One note in the darkness. Mustn't despair. That's the story of the Kursk. That's why we remember. And that's why, 24 years later, the damage report that revealed why the crew had no chance still has the power to break our hearts and to demand that we do better. Because they deserved better. Because we can do better. Because the best way to honor their memory is to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. The submarine is gone. The men are gone. But the lessons remain. And the words Dmitry Kolesnikov wrote in the darkness still echo across the years. Mustn't despair. Never forget. The end.